Sandra Bullock stepped into the luxury jewelry boutique, her presence understated yet undeniably graceful. She wore dark jeans, a black turtleneck, and a simple wristwatch. Nothing extravagant, just timeless elegance. The soft glow of chandeliers reflected off the pristine glass cases, illuminating the exquisite gems inside. Across the boutique, Margaret Winchester stood like a queen surveying her kingdom. Her white fur coat draped over her shoulders, diamonds sparkling at her wrists and ears. Every inch of her exuded wealth, the kind that didn't just exist, it commanded attention. Her eyes flickered toward Sandra, narrowing as she took in the actress's subtle appearance. "Are they letting just anyone in these days?" she murmured to the friend beside her, not bothering to lower her voice. Sandra heard the remark. It wasn't the first time she had encountered someone who judged people by their attire, and it wouldn't be the last. But she didn't react. She simply continued admiring the collection of sapphire rings in front of her. The boutique staff, well-trained in discretion, pretended not to hear. Yet a few exchanged knowing glances, sensing the tension. Margaret, however, wasn't finished. Her wealth had always given her the ability to dictate who belonged in places like this, and Sandra, dressed so simply, did not meet her criteria. Margaret turned slightly, lifting a necklace adorned with emeralds. "You know," she said in a voice that carried across the boutique, "some of us understand the value of dressing appropriately for our surroundings." Her words hung in the air, sharp as the diamonds she so adored. Sandra remained unbothered, fingers grazing the edge of a velvet-lined tray. If Margaret expected an argument, she wouldn't get one. Some people thrived on confrontation, but Sandra had long since learned that silence could be the most cutting response of all. Then the door chimed. A man entered, dressed in a black leather jacket, his movements unhurried, his presence magnetic. He didn't need to announce himself. People simply noticed. Margaret barely spared him a glance at first, but then whispers began circulating among the boutique's patrons. "Is that?" someone murmured. Margaret's curiosity piqued. She turned, eyes scanning the man who had effortlessly stolen the room's attention, and then her breath hitched. Keanu Reeves. She felt her stomach drop, her confidence wavering for the first time. Because if Keanu Reeves was here, and if he had just smiled at the woman she had so carelessly dismissed, then Sandra Bullock was not just anyone. Margaret's fingers tightened around the necklace she was holding. This wasn't going to end the way she had planned. Margaret's grip on the necklace tightened as she watched Keanu Reeves approach Sandra Bullock, with an ease that made the entire boutique pause. There was something infuriating about the way he moved. Unbothered, unpretentious, yet commanding in a way that made even the most self-important people shrink in his presence. Sandra turned slightly, her expression barely shifting, yet there was an unmistakable warmth in her eyes as she met Keanu's gaze. A quiet understanding passed between them, one that required no words. Margaret, however, was not used to being overlooked. She cleared her throat, shifting the necklace in her hands as if to remind everyone that she, too, belonged in this space. "Funny," she said, forcing a polite smile. "I would have expected someone like you to prefer a more refined atmosphere." Keanu turned his head slightly, his dark eyes assessing Margaret in a way that made her stomach tighten. He didn't look angry or even annoyed. No, his expression was worse. It was amused, as if he had encountered this exact kind of arrogance before and found it tiresome. "I was just thinking the same thing," he said smoothly, adjusting his jacket collar. "Strange how class has nothing to do with expensive jewelry." The weight of his words settled over the room like a hush before a storm. The boutique's attendants, previously trying to appear neutral, suddenly stood at full attention. A few customers who had been browsing in silence now watched the unfolding scene with thinly veiled interest. Margaret's polite facade faltered for just a moment before she straightened her posture, determined not to let him have the last word. "Class," she echoed, her voice laced with forced amusement. "Well, I suppose everyone has their own definition of it." Keanu smiled, slow and knowing. "Yeah," he said, his tone light but firm. "Some people define it by how they treat others." Margaret felt heat rise to her face. There was nothing openly confrontational in his words, yet somehow they cut deeper than any insult. Because for the first time in a long time, She wasn't the one controlling the narrative. Sandra, still silent, simply turned her attention back to the jewelry case, tracing a finger along a delicate necklace adorned with emeralds. The moment wasn't hers to claim. Keanu had already said everything that needed to be said, and that, more than anything, made Margaret's breath hitch. She had expected to make Sandra feel small. Instead, she was the one shrinking. One of the boutique's employees hesitated before stepping forward, addressing Sandra with a newfound enthusiasm. "Would you like to try this piece on, Ms. Bullock?" Margaret stiffened. The shift was undeniable. Where before the staff had been indifferent, now they were attentive, accommodating, because now they understood who they had underestimated. Sandra glanced at Keanu, the faintest hint of a smirk on her lips. "What do you think?" Keanu tilted his head slightly, pretending to study the necklace with exaggerated consideration. "Bullock," he said with a smirk, "everything suits you." Margaret's stomach twisted. The light-hearted exchange between them, effortless and natural, was more humiliating than any direct confrontation. Because she was no longer part of the conversation, she had become the lesson. And for the first time in her life, she didn't know how to fix it. Margaret felt her pulse quicken, though she masked it behind a well-rehearsed, indifferent smile. Years of social maneuvering had trained her to maintain composure, even when the ground beneath her was shifting. But this was unfamiliar territory. She had always been the one people tried to impress, the one whose approval was sought after, whose presence dictated the atmosphere of any room she entered. Yet standing here now, with Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock effortlessly owning the space without trying, Margaret realized something unsettling. She was no longer in control. The boutique attendant carefully lifted the emerald necklace Sandra had been eyeing and held it out for her to inspect. Sandra took it, rolling the delicate chain between her fingers, as if deciding whether it was worth her attention. Margaret had seen this before. The power balance in a luxury store could shift in an instant, dictated not just by money but by influence. And suddenly Sandra, the woman she had so easily dismissed, had all of it. Margaret refused to let that stand. She let out a light, practiced laugh and stepped closer, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she gestured toward the necklace. "Oh, that piece?" she said smoothly. "It's lovely, but a bit understated, don't you think? Some women prefer something more striking." Sandra finally turned to her, her expression unreadable. Keanu, standing beside her, leaned in just slightly. "You mean something louder?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "Something that demands attention?" Margaret's smile faltered just enough for him to notice. She met his gaze, her carefully crafted confidence flickering. "I just mean," she said, tilting her head, "that certain pieces suit certain people. You have to have the presence to carry them." Keanu let out a thoughtful hum. "Interesting. I always thought presence had more to do with character than accessories." A subtle shift rippled through the boutique. Margaret knew how these games were played, but Keanu wasn't playing by her rules. He wasn't engaging in the quiet competition of wealth and status. He was exposing it for what it was, shallow. And worse, everyone in the store was beginning to see it too. Sandra, still holding the necklace, finally spoke. "I think it's perfect," she said simply, turning back to the attendant. "I'll take it." The words landed like a final note in an argument Margaret had already lost. The boutique attendant straightened immediately, her demeanor now entirely focused on Sandra. "Of course, Ms. Bullock. Let me prepare it for you." Margaret barely registered the murmurs spreading among the other customers. She didn't need to hear them to know what they were saying. Keanu stepped back, his hands slipping casually into his jacket pockets. "Great choice," he said, his tone light. "But then again, I figured you'd make the right one." Sandra shot him a knowing look, her lips curving slightly. "Well, you do have good instincts." Margaret had never felt so irrelevant. The boutique, once a place where she held authority, now felt suffocating. The energy had shifted entirely, and she was no longer the focal point. For the first time in a long time, Margaret Winchester wasn't the woman everyone was looking at. She was the woman they were looking away from, and it was unbearable. Margaret felt a tightness in her throat as the reality of the moment settled around her. The boutique, once her personal stage, had become a place where she no longer held the spotlight. Conversations resumed, but not in the way she was used to. People weren't whispering about her wealth, her presence, or her fashion choices. They were whispering about how Keanu Reeves had just cut through her carefully crafted persona with nothing more than a few words. And worse, how Sandra Bullock hadn't even needed to say much at all. The boutique attendant returned with the emerald necklace, now nestled inside a luxurious velvet box. "Here you are, Ms. Bullock," she said with a polite smile, offering the package with a level of attentiveness that hadn't been there before. Sandra accepted it effortlessly, sliding her card across the counter without hesitation. Margaret's nails dug into the strap of her Hermes bag. This was not how things were supposed to go. She had walked into this boutique as the woman who set the standard, the one others looked up to, or at the very least feared. But now, standing in the presence of two people who carried themselves with confidence that required no validation, she realized how fragile her own sense of superiority really was. She needed to leave. Margaret inhaled sharply and straightened her shoulders, forcing a polite smile onto her face. If she couldn't win, she could at least pretend she wasn't bothered. "Well," she said smoothly, adjusting the pristine white fur on her shoulders, "it's always fascinating to see how different people interpret luxury." Keanu tilted his head, his expression unreadable. Sandra simply turned to the boutique attendant and took back her card. "Thank you," she said, ignoring Margaret entirely. And that, more than anything, was the final blow. Margaret wasn't dismissed with words. She was dismissed with silence. The boutique doors opened and Sandra turned to leave, Keanu following at an easy pace. He didn't spare Margaret another glance, and that stung more than anything else. She had expected confrontation. She had expected some parting remark that would allow her to respond, to regain even a sliver of control. But instead, she had been given nothing. And somehow that was worse. As the doors swung shut behind them, the weight of the moment fully settled on Margaret's chest. The boutique no longer felt like hers. The store attendants, once so eager to cater to her, returned to their duties with renewed enthusiasm, but not toward her. The other customers, though trying to appear indifferent, stole quick glances at her, their expressions unreadable but knowing. Margaret stood still for a moment, staring at the gleaming jewelry cases as if they could offer her some kind of reassurance. But for the first time in a long time, she felt small. She turned sharply on her heel and strode toward the exit, her heels clicking against the polished floor. The cool Beverly Hills air greeted her as she stepped outside, but it did little to soothe the heat rising in her face. She pulled out her phone, scrolling mindlessly, needing a distraction. But nothing held her attention. Keanu's words replayed in her mind. "What really matters is how we treat others." Margaret clenched her jaw. She wanted to dismiss it, convince herself that it had just been an off moment, a misunderstanding, but deep down, she knew better. She had always prided herself on being admired, but now for the first time, she realized the truth. She wasn't admired, she was feared, and there was a difference. She found herself standing in front of another luxury boutique, but for once, she wasn't looking at the jewelry in the window. She was looking at her own reflection, and she didn't like what she saw. For years, she had surrounded herself with people who thought like her, who reinforced her belief that status was everything, that wealth determined worth. But now, after a single moment in that boutique, she couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong. Hours later, sitting in her car, she found herself staring at her phone again. She had opened and closed the app multiple times, unsure of what to say, but finally she took a deep breath and started typing. "Today I learned that you can buy a diamond, but you can't buy class. Thank you, Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves, for the lesson." She hesitated, then without overthinking, she pressed post. She didn't know what kind of response to expect, but for the first time she didn't care. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something different. Margaret set her phone down and exhaled slowly, because for the first time, she wasn't afraid of change. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to begin. Margaret sat in her car, gripping the steering wheel tighter than she needed to. The boutique's golden lights still glowed in her rearview mirror, a reminder of the scene she had just walked away from. She had lost, not in a way that could be measured in money or status. She was still wealthy, still influential, still dressed in the finest clothes money could buy. But she had lost something far more fragile, the illusion of control. Her fingers hovered over her phone screen, refreshing the post she had just made. The likes and comments were already pouring in. Some people agreed with her, others didn't. Margaret tapped on one of the comments from a woman she didn't know. "The first step to change is recognizing where we went wrong." Margaret scoffed, tossing her phone onto the passenger seat. Change. What did that even mean? She had spent her entire life perfecting the art of being admired. She knew the right people, attended the right events, wore the right brands, and yet standing in that boutique, none of it had mattered. Keanu Reeves hadn't been impressed. Sandra Bullock hadn't been intimidated. They had treated her with the kind of indifference that stripped away every layer of importance she had built around herself. Margaret's jaw tightened as she thought back to Keanu's words. Some people define class by how they treat others. She hated how they lingered in her mind, refusing to be ignored. With a frustrated sigh, she grabbed her bag and stepped out of the car. The night air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of Beverly Hills traffic. Without thinking, she started walking. She didn't know where she was going. She just needed to move. As she passed by another high-end boutique, she caught her reflection in the glass. A woman in a flawless white coat, diamond earrings, perfectly styled hair, and yet for the first time, she didn't recognize herself. For the first time, she wondered who she was when the luxury was stripped away. She had spent her life believing that wealth equaled worth. But if that were true, why had Sandra, in her simple black turtleneck, carried more presence in that room than Margaret ever had? She shook the thought away and kept walking. But deep down, something was shifting. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret Winchester didn't know who she wanted to be. Margaret walked aimlessly, her heels clicking against the pavement in a rhythmic echo. The city around her buzzed with life. People laughing outside restaurants, cars gliding past in polished elegance. But she felt detached from it all. For years, she had believed she was untouchable, that her wealth, her status, her carefully curated world made her immune to moments like this, moments where doubt crept in and refused to leave. But tonight, the mask had cracked. She turned a corner and found herself outside a cafe, one of those quaint places she usually overlooked in favor of five-star establishments. A soft glow spilled from the windows, casting a warm light onto the sidewalk. Inside, people sat with steaming mugs and quiet conversations, wrapped in an atmosphere that had nothing to do with money. Margaret hesitated, then almost without thinking, she stepped inside. The scent of freshly brewed coffee wrapped around her as she approached the counter. The barista, a young woman with tired eyes but a kind smile, greeted her without the usual hesitation Margaret was used to from service staff. "What can I get you?" Margaret opened her mouth, then paused. She always ordered the most expensive item on the menu, as if price equated to quality. But here, standing in a place where no one knew or cared who she was, it didn't seem to matter. "Just a coffee," she said finally. The barista nodded, ringing her up without fanfare. No extra attention, no nervous glances, just a normal interaction. Margaret paid and stepped aside, watching as the girl moved behind the counter, pouring drinks with practiced efficiency. For the first time in years, Margaret felt ordinary, and oddly, it didn't feel as terrible as she had always feared. She took her coffee and sat by the window, staring out at the world she had spent so much time controlling. Had she ever actually lived in it? Her phone buzzed beside her, another flood of notifications from her earlier post. Margaret picked it up, scrolling past comments both praising and criticizing her. But one, simple and direct, caught her eye. "Real change starts when you stop performing and start listening." She let out a slow breath, her fingers hovering over the screen. Then, in a moment that surprised even her, she typed a reply. "I'm listening." She put the phone down, took a sip of her coffee, and for the first time in her life, sat with the silence. And maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something real.